everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick comparison between the Vaio Z Canvas on the left and the Microsoft Surface Book on the right. Now, in terms of pricing, the Vaio Z starts at over $2,000 US, whereas the Surface Book starts at $14.99. So from a pricing perspective, I think consumers are initially in a state of shock by how much more the Vaio product commands, at least at its base configuration. Keep in mind that at its base configuration, it is far more powerful than what the Surface Book can do if what you're after specifically revolves around processing power. And that's because rather than the ultra-low voltage Skylake 6th Gen Intel processor found in the Surface Book, which is very competent, it is simply not in the same class as the Haswell, that is right, 4th generation Intel quad-core processor that you'll find here in the Vaio Z Canvas. And that is one of the biggest differentiating factors right out of the gate. So even though they may share very similar weight, because they do, 2.73 or 4 pounds for the Vaio Z. Without the keyboard adds another 0.75. The Surface Book comes in at a little under 3.5 pounds. So they're almost exactly the same weight, which is baffling to me why so many consumers I've spoken to feel that the Vaio Z is heavier. I think that's because simply the actual tablet section of this device is heavier than the Surface Book, at least in terms of the weight balance. But otherwise, again, a wash when it comes to the actual physical weight that these two devices share. Now, remember, the Surface Book does have a 13.5-inch display, 3000 by 2000. The Vaio Z, on the other hand, 12.3, just like the Surface Pro 4, but with a little bit more than 2000 2K resolution. And another thing I want to point out about the display difference in terms of quality is that the Vaio Z, much like its name, Canvas, is really targeted at a certain type of consumer that is willing to pay for the attributes that it brings together, whereas the Surface Book is really aiming to be a product that any consumer, any walk of life, any student or professional of any type could walk right into. The Z is not after that consumer, and one of the defining differences is in the display. The 12.3-inch display that I mentioned here has an Adobe RGB rating of over 90%, I believe 95% accuracy. So if you need color proofing, if you need the ability to make sure that whatever you've captured, both still or video, or you're doing print ad work, is going to be exactly what you see on screen, this is the machine you need to own. Now, granted, Microsoft has come a really long way with their Pixel Sense technology from the 1st Gen Surface Pro 4, and that can be seen here, or rather Surface Pro 1, but in the Surface Pro 4 and Surface Book, we have Pixel Sense and higher resolution, and it does pay off. But it tops out at 99% of simply the, not the Adobe sRGB, but simply the sRGB spectrum. So color accuracy is good here, but much better on the Vaio. So that's something I want to point out immediately. So even though you got a bigger screen, more resolution, in my opinion, the better display lives on the Vaio. Now, when it comes to pen technology, and I haven't gotten to anything else yet, you already know the processor in the Vaio is much more powerful. And granted, if you don't plan on actually running any software that requires a processor of this caliber, which basically is desktop replacement class, for those of you wondering if you don't really know the difference between a low voltage and what sits inside the Vaio, the difference is that what's inside the Vaio tablet would traditionally be found in a desktop replacement laptop, or notebook, I should say, whether it's a gaming system, whatever it may be. That's basically the highest end mobile processor you're going to find that's going to give you comparable performance to what would traditionally, again, require a desktop. The Surface Book, on the other hand, sets sights right where the Surface Pro 4 is. Of course, you can opt to pick up the dedicated GPU, something that doesn't exist in the Vaio world, but I don't really feel that either of these machines are for gamers. And if you have the extra processing power here, you don't really care about the extra processing power of the 1 gig video RAM dedicated NVIDIA GPU solution that's inside the optional, more expensive Surface Book pricing. And I say that because the Surface Book goes all the way up to over $3,000. The Vaio tops out at I believe $31.99. And another key difference is the PCI Express drive here in the Vaio. Even though we're not getting the latest gen Intel Skylake quad-core chip, we are getting the latest of everything else, specifically the PCI Express drive if you go with the 512 gig model with 16 gigs of RAM, which is what I went with personally. You're not going to get that same performance here in the Surface Book, and, well, that's just something I felt was appropriate to point out. Now, I've been holding the pens for a while because, interestingly enough, even though Microsoft owns N-Trig, which is responsible for the entire pen experience in the Surface Pro 4 and Surface Book lineup, as well as the Surface Pro 3, that's where it began, and they did purchase the company, Vaio still has, from their patent library, some rights to what they paid N-Trig for in the past, and they have revamped that, improved upon it, so these pens can actually be interchanged. You can use the Surface Pro 4 pen if you pick it up on its own with the Vaio if you choose to. The Vaio does have a very, I would say, competent pen, and then the rubber grip they give, 2-button capability is a nice touch, definitely differentiates a little bit, and I think has a more premium feel overall than the Surface line pen, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to be what you particularly prefer. Plenty of people I know will prefer this over the Vaio pen and the other way around, but when it comes to actually inking, which I'm not going to demo because I'm far from an artist, I can tell you that the tracking on the Vaio, simply because of that quad-core 4th gen Haswell chip, destroys what the Surface Book can do, and that's simply because it's relying on the power of the processor when it comes to actually tracking. Also, Vaio's done a great job, even though Microsoft has upped the levels of sensitivity from 256 to 1024 in this new model and changed the tips so they're replaceable to really give you as natural a writing or inking experience as possible, and even gave a rubberized tip for erasing also in a natural sense. And Vaio doesn't have that, nor does it have the magnetic capability to attach, which is why Vaio includes a plastic mount that basically gets attached to the side of the machine that I'll show you soon. Here we have the ability to just magnetically attach this right here. You can see it actually pulling through. Vaio also integrated magnetic capability, but it's nowhere near the strength. They didn't, frankly, put a magnetic strip like this on the pen, so that probably explains why. This was an aesthetic trade that Microsoft was willing to make in order to satisfy consumer complaints, and I understand it. And actually, I think it's a great move on their behalf. I was not a big fan of the Surface Pro 3 having just a dangling tab with double-sided tape. But beyond the processors and displays, because I've covered both of that, when it comes to RAM, I mentioned this model, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gig PCI Express drive. Here we have 8 gigs of RAM, the Skylake i5 processor, which very competent, but of course nowhere near the capability of the Haswell quad-core chip in here. And I'm not really interested in a debate in the comments, folks. If you're going to start that discussion, I'll end it, because there is no comparison. And too many consumers think they're educated on this and simply are not. Another thing to note is the major difference in the keyboard experience. And that goes to the Surface Book hands down. You know, the Surface Book, let me just go over profile before I get to that. Same weight as the Vaio. You have the dedicated charging port there, which is Microsoft's proprietary magnetic style charger that they developed for the Surface Pro 3, and it is great, no question about it. Amazing that Apple couldn't find a way to sue them for it. And then you've got a mini display port out capable of 4K at 60 hertz, your headphone microphone combo jack right there, all ventilation around the system, volume rocker and power button, the lip right there to actually open up the system. And then on the left side, we have our USB 3.0 ports, as well as our full-size SD card slot, which unfortunately you cannot put the SD card all the way into. It's going to leave it half exposed. That means it's not a permanent storage place. So storage expandability really is pretty much fixed on this bad boy. Again, 256 gigs here, but only 128 in the $1,500 starting price point. And that's why people who think this is a value compared to the Vaio really need to take a long look at what they need, because once they spec out a Surface Book to the same specifications, and it still won't, of course, have that quad-core processor, but as the Vaio, they really will be getting a lot less for their money at the end of the day, even if we're talking about from a gaming perspective, because again, I don't find there to be any major gaming prowess. Now, when it comes to cameras, this is a bit ironic. Vaio, even though they're not Sony anymore, still has access to a great patent library. The 8 megapixel camera on the back of the Vaio is good. The front-facing 1 megapixel or 0.99, I don't know what they were thinking. Microsoft, though, got it right. 5 megapixels on the front, 8 here on the rear, and it does what it should. When it comes to battery life, you're going to get better battery life out of the Surface Book because it has a battery both in the tablet portion as well as the actual keyboard portion. And the utility of the entire experience with the Surface Book is that it can double as just a 13.5-inch 3x2 tablet. This, on the other hand, is all about living in a tablet world. So the keyboard detaches. It is magnetic. So that's one thing already I'll tell you now. Much like the Kickstand with the Vaio, if you're looking for an attached keyboard, you simply aren't going to get it here. Charging LED light right here in the lower right corner. You may have noticed while this was actually magnetically docked on the screen here, protecting the screen, which it does act as a nice magnesium cover. You may have noticed the amber light right here because it is charging. If I pick up the unit, you can see we also have rubber feet all along this, and that's simply because they're there to protect it in the event that this is the surface you place facing down. Now, the kickstand is probably my biggest critique of the Canvas, but in the same vein, I can see why Vaio did this, and this is not making an excuse for them. I'm not here to do that. I'm not paid by any of these companies. Basically, what it comes down to is that you've got this easel-type stand. I probably should pull this off first. You can see the keyboard actually getting upset with me. And it's not that difficult to pry open. Give it a little bit of a push, but it is all weight-based. So essentially, it's now at its fully open position. And once you sit this down, you're going to have it upright in that position, locked. And then it's all a matter of you basically just tilting it to the position that you precisely want. And what this does better than the Surface Pro 4, or in this case, the Surface Book without hesitation, is that for inking, you have a perfect surface, basically. There's not going to be any shake or wobble. And to close it up, you simply just bring it all the way down, and then you have your solution now closed back up. You can throw the screen protector / keyboard right back on it. When it comes to going around this machine, it's pretty incredible what Vaio has done here. A lot of people look at it like it's just a tablet with powerful internals, but that's what the Surface Pro 4 is, folks, and the Surface Book too, just with a big keyboard attached to it. So we've got the pen holder here, which is also the magnetic strip I was talking about, not quite strong enough, which is why there's a plastic pen mount. Volume rocker, power button. I actually do prefer this layout, believe it or not, over the top side layout of both the Surface Pro 4 and the Surface Book. As we go around, speakers here at the bottom, also a micro USB port to charge the keyboard independently in case you don't want it sipping juice from the battery here in the Vaio. And I say that because, as I mentioned earlier, the Vaio simply cannot get the battery life that you will get from the Surface Book or the Surface Pro 4 for that matter. But battery life has improved for me. Initially, I was looking at 4 to 5 hours with regular use. Now I'm seeing over 6. So that's promising, and that's part of the reason that I'm actually leaning towards this becoming a daily driver for me. Not that I'm giving up on my Surface Pro, because still love that machine. It's where it all began, but this is kind of the culmination. This is more of what I've been waiting for, which is laptop, true, almost desktop class performance in the form of a tablet. So go anywhere. I don't need any dongles, and that's because of what you see right here. Charging port, standard, what used to be Sony, but now is a Vaio charging port. Nothing too crazy about that. No magnetic proprietary tech here. A Ethernet port, which, you know, when I was at the Microsoft store, they said, what do you need an Ethernet port for? Well, just about everything. I mean, granted, Wi-Fi is everywhere, and if you've got a great network at home, that's fantastic. But when you travel, when you're on the road, which is what I'd like to think machines like this do and live to do, rather, Ethernet is kind of a necessity. And to just tell me I have to carry along another accessory that, by the way, is going to bottleneck the speed of that Ethernet port, aka a USB 3.0 adapter, that's not something I want to do in 2015, let alone we're really just about in 2016. HDMI 2.0 right here, so you've got true 4K out over that. true 4K out over this display port, full-size SD card slot that your SD card is going to completely basically be seated in. Yes, a lip will be exposed just for being able to do the spring action ejection move, but otherwise it is in there. It's not going to snag on things. It's not halfway protruding like it is on the Surface Book. 2 full-size USB 3.0 ports, one of which is also capable of quick charge. Your headphone jack right there. At the top of the machine, we've got 2 physical buttons, which can be assigned functions. One of them will turn off, or rather basically make it go straight into pen mode. These are just nice touches of Vaio realizing they've got to make more use of what they can. The rear camera I mentioned is 8 megapixels right there. Ventilation here on the side. All of your ventilation, by the way, is on the top. And this is another area that, believe it or not, Vaio outdid Microsoft. And this applies to both the Surface Pro 4 as well as the Surface Book I'm comparing it with today. When this thing is under heavy load or even just light browsing, basically anything I do with it, it does not come anywhere near the noise levels that the Surface Book or Surface Pro 4, for that matter, will achieve. And if that's simply because of the way Vaio designed this, kudos to them. I mean, I did read a lot. There are even visual representations of the internals of this fan design. There are 3 legitimate fans in here that Vaio claims cancel each other out in terms of their noise. And I have to say, it's true. It does an amazing job, and considering how powerful this thing is, it doesn't get very hot, and it doesn't get very loud. So no instances here like I have with the Surface Book where all of a sudden there's popping noises, driver bugs. I've got power profiles out of the box. Yes, you can achieve that with the Surface Book with doing some registry edits, but that's not for the average consumer out of the box to be doing. And yes, the kickstand is a flaw in that even though I think it is great for inking, and that's what most of the design of the canvas is about. That's why the keyboard is detached, by the way, folks. Vaio believes that most artists want to be able to work with their canvas, so to speak, on its own and the keyboard out of the way. Something the Surface Book is a perfect example of where it's a nightmare. Even though you can flip the tablet portion of this over and work in it in a magazine style or clipboard fashion, it still is far from being the best way to ink or write on it, in which you then want to take the tablet off, but then there's no kickstand to work with. So the kickstand's great for that. Where it's not great is, well, you can't use it on your lap unless you plan on resting it on one leg, and then the keyboard's detached, so you'll find yourself using the on-screen keyboard. So you really need a desk to work with this, no question about it. Even sitting on a bed, it's going to wobble. It'll stay up, but unless you have it in more of one of the flat positions, it's going to have a lot of give because of its center weight distribution on the mount. So I wish they would have been able to give us a wider mount, same sort of function even, because I think the idea is great. It really does provide an experience that's unlike any other, but still leaves a lot to be desired in terms of functional use anywhere outside of a desk. But remember, the canvas is really all about being that easel for artists. So I think in that sense, they knew exactly what they were doing. Now, if I power this up, I got to get to the right side. I'm Surface Booking myself here. Let me go ahead and hit the power button so you get some display here. And very quick to start up on both of these machines. You can see reflective display, but that color accuracy is fantastic on this. I mean, it's just another level compared to what you're going to get out of any other machine. You can see right now I've got screen brightness up to 100%. And people who feel that this is heavy, I think that's mostly in their head, just because, much like the Surface Book, all of the internals are in the tablet portion. The tablet portion here, though, is a lot thicker and heavier because, well, not only does it have a much more powerful processor, a much more robust cooling system, but then it's also got all of these ports that, with the Surface Book or the Surface Pro 4, you need to bring an arsenal of accessories, or at the very least, the docking system, which still won't accomplish what this thing can on its own with a charger and a case. So there's a lot to be said for that. But I want to pull up a web page and just give you a quick look at what to expect. Let's open up ESPN. Wi-Fi performance on this is great, by the way. No issues with that. And Just getting this out of the way. Give you some colors to actually look at here. Get the guys' jerseys in frame. Put this down and open up the Surface Book. Another thing I want to address is the actual keyboard, which I'm going to get to now. Before I even do that screen side-by-side comparison, because this is one area where the Surface Book does absolutely annihilate the Vaio, and that's because even though this is a very good keyboard, the trackpad works well. We have no backlit keys, which at over $2,000, I cannot really forgive or excuse Vaio for not realizing that even if it would have taken making this a little bit thicker, backlit keyboard, pretty much par for the course when you're in this price range. Furthermore, I think they could have come up with a way that we could have had the option of having this attached similarly to a Surface Pro product, and then had the ability to detach it and still use the wireless communication. I believe it's, I don't remember if it's RF or Bluetooth, but either way, it does a really good job, very accurate. So I like the keyboard a lot. Design is great, but lack of backlit keys and that lack of actual connectivity option is something that for some of you will be a make or break situation. Now, if I open up the Surface Book, on the other hand, you can see that the keyboard is, well, the keyboard you'd find on a MacBook Pro, but maybe even better, and arguably one of the best keyboards on any laptop in the market. So it's got that going for it, no question about it. And then if I go ahead and hit the release button, first I have to unlock the system, I believe. So let me go ahead and do that. But then if I hit the release button, it'll tell me it's ready to be detached. Green light should mean it's detachable. Let's see. And it is. And I will put the keyboard on the side here for a moment. You can now see the screens side by side. And one thing I can tell you is that the brightness, looks like I advanced to a page I did not want to. The brightness on the Surface Pro 4 and Surface Book alike is definitely punchier. It has a higher rating than what you're going to get on the Vaio, but when it comes again to color accuracy, that's where things become very different. Now, of course, this thing is not cooperating. ESPN really maybe not the best site, so I'm going to go ahead and change that right now. And we're only getting this keyboard because I am in Chrome, which automatically deploys it, as you may have noticed. If I just go ahead and do this, you're going to get a little practical Wi-Fi test as well. And in terms of speaker performance, also very, very similar. Now, also my lighting is slightly different. I mean, from what I'm seeing on my preview screen, the Surface Book screen just looks whiter, much brighter, punched up to a level that the Vaio can't achieve. The Vaio also a little bit more glare on the finish of the screen, no question about that as well. But when it comes to, again, color accuracy and the way that even the color red is reproduced, if I bring it in very closely here, I can tell you right now that there is oversaturation going on in the Surface Book. Now, this doesn't mean that the Surface Book isn't very good, because it is. There's no question about it. Also take into account that both of these tablets are sitting under some intense lighting. So that's going to change the way they would look in person. So I highly recommend you see these in person. After all, you're spending a lot of money. It makes sense to do so. But when it comes to performance, they're both incredibly smooth. The zooming is, pinch to zoom is not going to be an issue. These are both powerhouses in their own right, but very different. I mean, look at the thickness difference here. It's almost twice as thick. That is the Vaio versus the Surface Book. And that is when it's detached. Of course, the Surface Book with its keyboard is then going to get a lot closer to being the same thickness, if not obviously more, which it is. So these are actually pretty close. Oh, I've activated some video. I'm going to go ahead and shut that off. But you can now see exactly how close these really are. So to me, it really comes down to what you actually practically need and also what kind of value you're looking to get. This on its own as a tablet is going to net you many more hours of actual use than this is going to. This is pretty much a dud once it's released from the Surface Book base, the keyboard. This, on the other hand, is really an independent entity, and then if you want to bring in to that the keyboard, you can, and the keyboard's incredibly light. Its biggest Achilles, besides battery life, which I think with the processor under the hood really isn't an Achilles at all, is again this keyboard. So it all depends. You can switch on and off the keyboard so that it won't constantly be sucking juice every time it gets paired up like this. So it's really up to you. But I think the overall package, and for the amount of money being spent, the Vaio delivers far more when it comes to capability, practicality, than most consumers will think. This is not being marketed. You're not seeing commercials in prime time for it. And there's a reason. This is the first computer that Vaio was selling in the States since it was basically dropped by Sony and purchased by a Japanese holding group. Whereas the Surface Book is a flagship product trying to take on the world and redefine what a laptop should look like. And
Technology empowers us to
technology.
achieve more.
And, in a sense, it does really accomplish that. But in many ways, despite how great the screen looks, despite how great the entire machine looks, I can't help but point out the fact that this is really just an oversized, like a supersized Surface Pro 4 that's substantially more expensive, with no real performance gain except for battery life, an extra USB port, and I'm not even going to count the full-size SD card slot because, again, not being able to go flush. And in addition to that, you do, of course, get the physical keyboard, which I think is something that many consumers wanted. And I think that's why we ended up with it, because it's one of those things that Microsoft, as I've mentioned in the past, does listen to consumers. And, well, they did exactly that. And quite frankly, what keyboard in this instance would you rather have? You're looking at something like, the incredibly thin one that comes with the Vaio, or the Surface Book keyboard, which is larger, the trackpad, not twice the size, but close, definitely a much better trackpad here in the Surface Book keyboard, backlit keys, metal construction, and yes, it does have an additional battery, but as I've mentioned in other videos, that additional battery is really more about driving that 3000 by 2000 display, and the fact that, well, the battery inside the Surface Book 13.5-inch tablet, which is where all of the computing elements are other than the battery and possibly the NVIDIA GPU if you go with that option, live, that really meant that they didn't have much of a spot for a battery to begin with, which is why it was very convenient to stick it in here. So, this really comes down to, do you want a traditional physical laptop that is far from traditional in form and function, because that's exactly what the Surface Book is. It's a Surface Pro 4, as I mentioned before, in the form of a laptop, which is odd because Microsoft has been telling us for years now that they're making tablets that can replace laptops. Now they're making laptops that can replace tablets that consist of tablets. Go figure. Don't get too confused. I'm trying not to myself. Trying to get this reattached. There we go. But as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to bugs, there are definitely more quirks here in the Surface Book, just like there are in the Surface Pro 4, than the Vaio, whereas the Vaio is basically a laptop in a tablet form, but a powerhouse laptop, as I keep mentioning. Traditionally, what you would expect to find in an 8-pound package, or at least a 5, 6, or more pound package, maybe with something like the Razer Sans, of course, the dedicated GPU. The next step, by the way, would be to make something like this with the dedicated GPU and a keyboard that could actually connect. I think then Vaio would have a home run of epic proportions, because when you think about what you're spending, I've said this since I unboxed the Vaio, many consumers felt that the Surface Book just killed it basically out of the gate because of the dynamic price difference, starting price point. But what those consumers didn't take into account was what they were getting for their money beyond just the physical aesthetic of these two machines. And when you actually take a look at what you can do with this and how long this product is going to live as a functional machine, whereas this will be pretty easily replaced by the next generation, or not easily, but I think that there will be a lot of major improvements. If not, it could take till the 3rd gen, like the Surface Pro line did, to really come into its own. The point is, here you've got a fully functioning, basically laptop again in the form of a tablet, what Microsoft's been trying to do now for years, but has done with low voltage chips to accomplish battery life. Here you have really the best of both worlds. So again, the kickstand and the keyboard are the only weaknesses of the Vaio Z Canvas. The Surface Book, its only real weakness is how expensive it is for what only appears to be innovation rather than actually is. And I think the Surface Pro 4 is still where that innovation resides. Good start here with the Surface Book, but if you put these side by side, similar configuration, again, if this was the 512 gig model with 16 gigs of RAM, you still wouldn't have that same Samsung PCI Express drive, to my knowledge, that you have here in the Vaio. You wouldn't have the display with the color accuracy. Yes, you'd have a larger display, a little more battery life, and a better keyboard, but that's about it. And if you actually do care about pen input, let me bring that back one more time, because again, even though Microsoft may have worked a little bit more on redefining the pen, having the new tips, the eraser point, and also having controls through here that you don't have here with the Vaio pen, the performance of the Vaio pen plus the easel style kickstand is going to make for a much better inking experience for people who are looking solely for a dedicated machine to actually use pen input. So hopefully that covered all of your questions. I mean, clearly when it comes to gaming, Iris graphics here, and then you've got Intel integrated 520 in the base model, which is not as good as the Iris here, but once you step up again to the NVIDIA solution, it is going to outperform the Vaio. But otherwise, in just about every single regard, the Vaio is the superior machine, especially when you take into account pricing, because as I was mentioning before, for the build of the Vaio, it's actually going to cost you more than the 25, I believe, 99 that this runs. Again, the 16 gig, 512 gig model. Processor also stays the same across all 3 Vaio models. You can also step up to a 1 terabyte model, also with 16 gigs of RAM. But in the Surface Book world, you're looking at the same price just to get up to that RAM and hard drive size. Again, not the same SSD or PCI Express, I should say, but you're still living with an i5 or i7 that, granted, is Skylake, but ultra low voltage. 15 watt versus 46. These are not in the same class. So the more money you spend here will get you more RAM, it will get you more hard drive space, but it will not get you more computational power even when you top out at the i7 models, because they are still going to give you a quarter, I would say roughly, of the performance of this quad-core 4th gen Intel chip. So for everyone also who complains that this is only a 4th gen chip, yeah, I would have loved to have seen a Skylake quad-core in here, and I'm sure eventually we will if Vaio has a successful push or anyone decides to emulate what they've done here. But I'm really interested in the end of the day at what's available for us to purchase today. What is out now? Tomorrow is always nice to think about, but we live, life one day at a time, hopefully with our mindset on the future. But right now, there's just nothing more powerful and more complete. Again, I don't need to take any accessories except the charger with this on vacation or on a work trip, whereas with this, inevitably, I'm going to need something else, because even though it has more than the Surface Pro 4, it still doesn't match up with the Vaio, and it certainly doesn't match up with a lot less expensive competing products with similar low-voltage processors. So it's clear, the Surface Book, you are paying for the looks, the design, the engineering, and Microsoft, making their first laptop. No question about it. It's like paying higher prices at a restaurant that's has ambiance as opposed that doesn't. But here, the quality of the food isn't necessarily better, and that's a little bit disturbing. With the Vaio, on the other hand, yeah, you're still paying the rent. Much smaller company, by the way, now that they're no longer part of Sony. Several hundred employees. It's a small business. But this restaurant, on the other hand, is interested in making sure that the quality of the food is up to par and that you aren't just paying the rent, even though I admit you absolutely are. After all, economies of scale, because they're smaller, they can't have the margins that necessarily Microsoft can lean on when it comes to selling mass quantities. In fact, on the Microsoft Store to this day, there is still not a single review of this machine. And every time I've spoken to representatives at Microsoft stores, they all say everyone gravitates towards the Surface Book because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, they think this one's too heavy, which makes absolutely no sense. Again, I understand they mean that the weight distribution throws them off. They can't hold it in their hand the same way they can the tablet portion, but as soon as they realize you can't really use this tablet portion for anything, maybe, but sitting on the couch for an hour, you're going to realize holding this whole thing will become tedious. That's why it ends up on your lap, and then it's not a tablet at all. And maybe you should be looking at a Surface Pro 4 or another competing product from another manufacturer, which is why the Vaio is my pick in this comparison. Definitely the better machine when it comes to performance and being a complete solution rather than just, as I've said before, a supersized Surface Pro 4 with a great keyboard and very nice design. I mean, this is arguably one of the nicest laptops in the PC world and Apple world ever made, but I just wish we had a more powerful processor because of the prices that it commands. And we probably will see that in the next gen or third generation of this product because it is already an established success, no question about it. So two great options, very different, even though they weigh the same, look the same, because they are going to appeal to completely different users. If you work in video production, if you're a photographer, this is going to be the ideal machine, especially if you do any video rendering or you have to actually make use of that quad-core processor and love the convenience like I do of having everything in one piece of equipment, which is what I've been waiting for. The Surface Book, on the other hand, if you don't require all of that capability, even if you're a photographer, by the way, the Surface Book is a great solution with the SD card and that color accuracy being much higher than previous generations. I know that held back a lot of photographers from leaning on a Surface Pro product. Here with the Surface Book, they don't have that issue because the screen is simply brilliant, but definitely more oversaturated than what you'll find here in the Vaio, and that's because it simply doesn't live up to the Adobe sRGB ratings that you get with the Vaio 12.3-inch display. So again, both are fantastic options. It's a great time to be in the market for a hybrid. I'll also be doing a comparison to the Surface Pro 4 with the Vaio. So it's all a matter of what you need, and at the end of the day, if you don't need a quad-core processor, go with the $1499 model of the Surface Book. On the other hand, I don't really recommend any of the more expensive models in the Surface Book lineup because it just becomes, an instance of diminishing returns. You think you're getting more, but you're really just paying more, and you're really not getting that much more when it comes to performance, especially since what you're really getting is the aesthetic, and that's the same across the entire line. And even at the very base model, the processing power and capability is already enough to do just about anything, that you could do without needing what's inside the Vaio. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.